We go.
Yeah, good.
Why does every live broadcast start with "Are we go"? Okay. Good evening. Thank you everyone for coming. I really do appreciate you joining us. You've seen the presentation set up by Sarah, sort of explaining where we are. We've got a really great panel with us tonight. Dr. Nomsa Masuku is the Deputy CEO of the Electoral Commission. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Avani Singh is from Alt Africa, an attorney specializing in the legalities of social media. Social media, there are some, apparently. And Adam Oxford is from Area of Effect TV. He'll speak from a technical and civil point of view. So that's our panel. I'm afraid Professor Cooper, unfortunately, is ill this evening, otherwise he would have been with us. Dr. Masuku, I want to start with you. I suppose it's fairly obvious to say this is a new challenge for you. In 2016, maybe there was a little bit of this, but 2014, I don't think anyone really saw Twitter as an important thing or social media as an important thing in South African elections.
Certainly. In fact, going into the 2014 elections, all that we were doing as an election management body was raise an enabler to augment our presence on traditional platforms. Like, for example, the work that we do face to face, what we do on television, what we do on print, etc., etc. So that was the main concern in 2014. Going into 2016, however, we started seeing the beginnings of disinformation, and so for that reason, in the results operation centers, we started having a team of people whose only job was to sit on social media and track down those people that were posting things that had the possibility of casting aspersions onto the process and those of us who are running the process. And that was fairly successful. We'd get people to take down what they posted. And then after 2016, of course, we had the elections in America, which then made us start thinking very, very closely about what is it that we can do in that space of political campaigning. And so that is where we are. So we started conversations with political parties. The Electoral Commission has what is called party liaison committees, which are statutory creations. So when we've been discussing the matter, but I wouldn't say at this point in time that we have arrived at a point where I am comfortable that we have adequately providing for work that needs to be done around political campaigning and managing that space in the face of the cyber attacks that we are facing.
Just for clarity, I mean, jurisdictional issues in social media are hell for everybody.
Yes.
I know that people can be tracked down, I keep being told, and Vani, I'll come to you about that in a minute, but you do have jurisdiction over political speech during election time, don't you? I mean, the SABC is regulated, all other media organizations are regulated. Do you have any kind of function at all or any kind of jurisdiction over political speech from a political party's Twitter account or Julius Malema's Twitter account during the election?
Yes and no. If you look at the prohibited conduct, it allows us to deal with things like false representation and all those kinds of things, and then the code of conduct. The disadvantage with the code of conduct is that it only binds parties that are competing in an election, whereas prohibited conduct applies to everyone. However, we as an election management body just don't have the physical capacity and have not invested enough human capacity in order to do anything about it. So what we do is that we work in partnership with for example, ICASA, with, for example, the Advertising Standards Authority, which interestingly said that they don't focus on political campaigning. They thought the Electoral Commission did.
Sorry, people at the back are struggling, so if we can
To
use
hear
the
me.
mic.
I beg your pardon. We approached Advertising Standards Authority, which is under liquidation here.
Yeah.
They said, well, we are not tracking political campaigning. We thought the Electoral Commission was. And we said, no, we're not. We don't have the capacity to do so. So that is where we're sitting, where we realize there is a problem around political campaigning. It remains this broad space that, that doesn't have a person that is a dedicated resource looking at it and making sure that people don't wander away from what is acceptable.
Thank you. Avani, can I ask you just to pick that up? I mean, it's one thing if, he speaks hypothetically, Andilian Kuitama from Black First Land First says, I'm a proud constitutional delinquent and all white people must leave the country. That would probably be considered racist speech under the Electoral Code of Conduct. By the time the law catches up with Twitter, we're on to the next election.
No, absolutely, and we're seeing that now. A number of countries in a flurry have tried to enact different types of regulation, and a lot of it's quite reactionary. So it's this very hard-hitting brushstroke approach to try and shut down things, I think, without considering as carefully as we might ordinarily do with other pieces of legislation about what the impact that has on freedom of expression. And it's because I think elections are evoking a particular concern where we're trying to balance free speech with the need to ensure that there is appropriate appropriate exercise of political rights as well, and the risks that come into play with undermining democracy and those kinds of activities. And just to pick up on your question of jurisdiction, I guess, that's historically from the time that social media started gaining a significant momentum, has been one of the biggest challenges around enforcing any kind of cross-border jurisdiction. Coming to the primary question, I suppose, of first identifying who the wrongdoer is, and then implementing it, any kind of sanction against that person or recourse against that person, whether outside of the country. There are measures, I suppose, that are coming into play that are finding better footing. I think we're seeing better cooperation between state entities, in different countries. We're seeing much more interaction from the platforms also coming on board and engaging. But I agree with you completely. That still remains one of the historic challenges that we're still struggling with, I think.
We're going to do a lot of this with my friend. I have this image in my head, and maybe it's entirely wrong, but I have this image in my head of a group of people running computers. I don't know why. I always think they're in Russia. Maybe it's Israel or somewhere else, and that they're actually running these networks. Now, you could have someone where with an EFF banner. That's actually got nothing to do with the EFF. That's actually a spoiler for someone else. Just to track down that person, is it even technically possible? Adam, if you have an answer to that, feel free to pick it up, but whoever.
So I suppose the technical possibility I'm going to leave to Adam. But I think that's absolutely right. I think part of the strategy behind it is to intentionally mislead, so to make the information look credible, as if it's coming from the party that you speak against. And I think that's the subtle nuance we're seeing with much more sophisticated disinformation campaigns, where there's enough credible or realistic looking information that makes it quite difficult to discern what's true and false from there. And I think that comes back to, again, whatever approach we ultimately opt for. This goes to Sarah's point about the need for critical thinking and digital literacy skills to help people kind of draw those distinctions between what's true and not. But realizing that the biggest need is for there to be quite a nuanced approach in whatever steps we take.
Do you have a comment on that?
In terms of tracking people down on social media, well, obviously yes. And in this country we've seen people arrested and put into jail for things they've said on social media. So in some cases, yes, it's very easy to find out who's saying something. In terms of the big botnets, no, not really. We can see where they come from. Twitter's released a lot of information about particularly the botnets that originate from Russia and Iran. I think here around the Gupta bots are mostly based in India. We know that because we can track IP addresses and so on. And the big tech firms have been quite helpful in terms of releasing that information to researchers. So there's a lot of very good researchers in South Africa who are looking at this issue and reliably told me that it's much bigger than we reported so far. Even though a lot of reporting has been very good. But also, yeah, that's the question.
Yeah. The question is that if you can't actually identify this, and you can't, it's very difficult to act against them. So then, what do you do to insulate a democracy against this kind of problem? Dr. Masuda, do you have any suggestions? I mean, yes, we can ask people to be more critical. We can ask people to read more. But I mean, you know, authorities and governments around the world have been doing that for years. I suppose in a way you almost look at it and just hope that people switch Twitter off for a couple of weeks beforehand. But I mean, that kind of things happen in places like Cameroon.
Look, I think that is the fundamental problem. I think in South Africa we are asking for a kind of sophistication and analytical skills around how you process information around you. When we have a problem in the country generally around the levels of what we call substantive literacy. So fundamentally, we have a country where we have that problem. Now, it makes it harder to have a conversation around what is true and how you nuance a message, because it does take a particular level of a discipline, thinking discipline, an approach that is analytical, etc., etc. And so when you listen to radio and etc., let alone, never mind before you go to social media, you can understand that the level of discourse is sometimes leaves a lot to be desired. So it is a very difficult space. Now, if you think that the Electoral Commission is supposed to create an environment that is conducive to free and fair elections, this space has suddenly made that near impossible to do.
We have a habit in South Africa of trying to legislate our way out of trouble. You know, we you know, if there are too many accidents, we say lower the speed limits. We try and, you know, almost legislate certain things that seem impossible. Well, is there any legislation that can fix this? You spoke about reactionary reactions, almost, you know, sort of reactionary legislation. Is there anything you can think of that can fix this? I mean, apart from throwing people into jail for lying on Twitter, I mean, I can't see it.
So, you know, as I mentioned, there are a number of countries trying to address this, you know, simultaneously. And I just also wanted to kind of highlight some of the different ways in which people are going about it. I think the most common approach we're seeing is this tendency to want to criminalize speech, so making it offense. And I think whilst perhaps it's understandable, it's quite a risky approach, because in other contexts, most free speech advocates would strongly advise that criminalizing speech has a chilling effect to the extent that it's often a disproportionate, overbroad remedy that should be steered away from. Another approach that we're seeing in countries like Belgium, for example, is to create websites or resources that you know, make it available for people to list examples of misinformation, so that you can check if you are skeptical about something. Italy, for example, has established a portal where people can report examples of misinformation, and then that can be either followed up by the authorities or the Electoral Commission will run a campaign countering it. But I think so far there's really a dearth of good options available, and I think there's maybe, you know, a compounding model that, you know, of different steps that can be taken. I think the first thing is that for bodies like the Electoral Commission that play such a fundamental role and has the public authority and the independence to steer away from any notion that this might be an example of states trying to censor because of the independence in its mandate. I think offering capacity and support to the Electoral Commission from organizations that are able to do that, to help process complaints faster, with people who are, you know, from the media, with expertise in how you can, you know, discern between things like satire, opinion, versus what may actually be disinformation is quite important. And that's another good example that we've seen, which comes out of the African Commission guidelines on access to information in elections. It's this idea of a repository for political advertising, where political parties submit the adverts that they have to the repository, and where there's skepticism about whether another advert being circulated is. So I think there are quite dynamic measures, and I think the best measures we're seeing are the interdisciplinary ones, where you're seeing states working with civil society and academics and the platforms to kind of come up with joint responses to the challenges.
I want to play devil's advocate a little bit. So countries that would be particularly vulnerable to this. So basically, if we just accept for a moment the idea is to change the outcome of an election. Countries like Sweden, for example, the United States, Britain, people in those countries are likely to change who they vote for 3 or 4 times, maybe 5 times during their lifetime. In South Africa, we haven't seen that voting behaviour since 1994, and I think that speaks to the structure of our society and generally racialized inequality. Is it possible then that just by having a conversation like this, we're actually almost a little too worried? Or, and let me put my cynical side on, would that mean then that if you wanted to change an election, you actually have to change the narrative months before, and that we might already be seeing that happen? Adam, I don't know if you have a comment.
Yeah, I mean, so I think even in the US, I mean, a lot of the postmortems around the 2016 election, a lot of the research that was done on that found that the trolls and the automated disinformation campaigns didn't really change people's minds. What they did was they embedded, they enhanced people's views. They made people feel more strongly about issues than they had done before. They created a more politicized and binary society that we see now there. But yeah, I think it's right to be a little bit sceptical about how effective some of these tactics are. I mean, we can't forget that Cambridge Analytica, who were fingered for the Trump election, Brexit, they were also hired by during Kenyan elections on the losing side. So I think, and if you look at recent bot activity around Sergei Skripal's poisoning in the UK and the Jamal Khashoggi murder in Turkey recently, I mean, both of those instances, there's been huge amounts of bot activity around, and clearly they've not had any effect at all on changing the mainstream narratives there. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about how much power we ascribe to some of these networks.
We can't blame bots for Donald Trump, is there?
Look, I accept that, Adam. However, I think that what happens, especially in South Africa, is that it raises the temperature. It raises people's anger, and it translates into civil unrest. And what we've seen happening is that we have to change a voting station, because people are so angry and they feel that the only way that they can get attention is by attacking the Electoral Commission. We're seeing more and more of that. If you look at the by-elections in the Western Cape, for example, we have had to bring in the police, security people to protect our staff, because that's the only way that people are going to get attention. We increase security around the national office of the Electoral Commission. Commissioners are protected during that time because you become vulnerable. Because people say that the only way that they are going to get a response from anybody is if they attack the people that are running the elections. So I don't think that we are overreacting. I think it's an apt conversation to have. We may not have immediate solutions, but we're not going to get there if we don't talk about it and train ourselves to say, what else can we do? I find it also intriguing that the political parties tend to say to the Electoral Commission, what are you going to do about it? And we say to them, well, what are you going to do it? Because you see, the Electoral Commission does not legislate. You do. You have the power to legislate, and I take the limitations of trying to legislate your way out of it. However, more and more, what the political parties are saying is that the Electoral Commission is not doing anything about it. And it puts the Electoral Commission in a very invidious position, because it detracts you from what it is that you ought to do.
Adam, you look like you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say, I don't disagree at all. I think, you know, the danger of these kinds of campaigns is that they do polarise debate, and then they do intention is making money. I think there's also one of the difficult nuances in that is then going back to the freedom of speech issue, is how do you tell what is a bot campaign, what is misinformation, disinformation, and what is the way people genuinely feel. There was a great example in Scotland around the issue of Scottish independence, which obviously there's a lot of strong feelings, to say the least there. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with Ben Nimmo and the Digital Forensic Research Lab from the Atlantic Council. He's probably one of the premier bot spotters and has developed a lot of the techniques for identifying particularly Russian networks. But he was calling out genuine campaigners as being bots, and published a list of these are the top 10 bots that are active in the Scottish independence debate. and most of them turned out to be real people because that's how they felt.
Can I just... I mean, I'm interested that you say that because I'm always amazed at the difference in the sort of universes that South African Twitter and South African talk radio inhabit. They're like completely different worlds because with talk radio you have to put your name to it. And you can make a fake name and then you get lots of what we call 060 numbers which look to us newly bought SIM cards. Often, you know, it's a bought by a political party. 5 people phone and say the same thing. So I'm always intrigued by the complete difference in universe, which suggests there's something about the nature of Twitter and fakeness. We're going to take questions from the floor and just points of debate, or if you just can't stand one of us and want to say so because you think you're on Twitter for a moment, you know, we'll do that. But I suppose one of the questions would be, if we're going to be unable to fix this before the election, are you predicting that a more complicated election, even as everybody already says is going to be very highly contested, is this going to complicate the election more? Is that your expectation?
Our expectation is that because you've got close contestation in at least 3 provinces, you are going to have vicious discourse, and you are going to have people resorting to all sorts of tactics in order to make their point heard. And people are going to probably maybe not use bots as such, but what it is that they'll be throwing out for people to talk about, they will be doing so in order to inflame emotions. We're expecting a lot of that. And the worry, of course, for the Electoral Commission is that it will be, the anger will then be directed at the Electoral Commission because we are an easy target. We're a sitting duck. I'm not asking you to come out and say, save the Electoral Commission, but I'm just saying.
Questions, please. Anyone? Hands? Gosh, okay. Oh, sorry, right at the back. Nearly at the back.
So Brazil just had a presidential election, and Facebook closed down hundreds of accounts, and WhatsApp was looked at for the restricting broadcast. Is the commission doing anything with the tech industry to go at that side? That's kind of part one. And the other part is, you talk a lot about sort of the mudslinging and the viciousness that's going to take place on Twitter, or excuse me, on the platform, on social media. How much does that impact sort of the everyday voter? In South Africa, I think 2 nights ago, we had another conversation hosted by Media Monitoring Africa, and we talked about how many people actually have access, right? Access to information through the phones and whatnot. And so I just kind of like your take, because it seems to be 2 sides of this. There's one side, which is sort of the tech side, the bigger bot issue, and which is a serious issue. The other side is then, how much is this actually impacting, and yeah, what are your observations on that, or your impressions, comments there?
Where do I start? Right. There is that side, the technical side. But if you go into the ground, when you listen to opinion on the ground, where people take an opinion as fact, we encounter that all the time. For example, towards the 2014 elections, there was something that said that all people that are hired in the Electoral Commission are comrades. In other words, they belong to the Electoral Commission, where people marching over there. And that became quite a widespread understanding when you go to the ground. That is that kind of conversation that I am finding is very difficult. And then of course it then translates into what people talk about on social media. They tell us in the Electoral Commission that you are captured. We are called captured all the time. And if I showed you the statistics of how many people just say the Electoral Commission is captured, etc., etc. Are we having conversation with the tech giants? We have had an approach from Facebook, where we are looking at what are they going to do in the South African context. Once again, limitation inside the Electoral Commission is just that there are not enough warm bodies in order to follow through very quickly. But we've had that conversation. We had it also in 2016. So, but it needs to be nurtured and make sure that it translates into proper action.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on that as well, because I think that's a really good point. A couple of weeks ago, I think it was last week actually, Facebook did a really big photo shoot in their new war room they built for the US midterms with screens all around and several dozen moderators who are watching Facebook feeds to take down anything that's even remotely off base for the US election. But I'm not aware in terms of their moderation teams that they even have one person who speaks Zulu or Xhosa or any of the local languages here. I'd be very, very surprised if they do.
Yeah. I mean, are there degrees of susceptibility to this? I mean, I'm presuming Twitter is more susceptible than Facebook. Would I be correct?
So I think the short form nature of Twitter perhaps means that there's less content. So it's quicker. There's less information that backs it up, and I think maybe that's why the perception is that users on Twitter are more susceptible to it. But I don't know. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. The one thing that I did, sorry, just on your question, I mean, I think Brazil is a fascinating example, just in terms of all of the measures that they tried to put into place with the tech platforms. I mean, I think Brazil tried to close to 11 pieces of legislation to try and criminalize it, forms of it, none of which passed. They had a judgment from the electoral court saying that the impact of disinformation on the elections had the potential to annul the outcome because it was so significant. And yet, in practice, although I think it was maybe better than it could have been, I think the measures ultimately weren't as effective as many people had hoped, because there was still a number of concerning incidents that took place. And I think the risks are just on the question of perception. The risk is, one, sharing information that's false, but the other is using the term fake news to discredit true information if it doesn't cohere with what it is that you want to believe, and discredit those who are spouting that information as well.
More questions?
So, Afni earlier referred to the guidelines, the African guidelines on access to information elections. In particular, the one for internet platform providers to provide a transparent repository of political advertising, whether aimed on individuals or groups. So I want to ask Dr. Masuku, in your discussions with the tech giants, did you get those commitments that they will do so for the upcoming election?
No. In fact, we didn't follow through at all, but the approach was made. What an interesting development that we are watching is what is happening in the UK, where they are pushing for an independent commission to just focus on political debates, but that hasn't come to a logical end, and we don't know how it's going to pan out. But I don't think South Africans want to find yet another body in South Africa. I think it is probably better to retool the existing structures and force collaboration between the election management body and many other kinds of players, and deal with this matter instead of creating yet another structure, which means that you have a bloated structure where you're hiring people. I don't think that's the way to go. I think there are many other ways that you can do it without spending more money on yet another structure.
Adam, what do we know about the business of bot networks? And by that I mean, I'm reminded of an article years ago when, you remember when almost every email you got was spam, and I don't mean press releases from the DA. I mean actual spam, and someone managed to shut down 2 networks in Russia, and that was 40% of it gone in like a moment. Is it the same kind of business structure? Do we know anything about it at all? I mean, you used examples of Russia and Iran.
Yeah, and at the moment, I think it's fair to say that there is a bit of a lull in terms of this kind of activity, because there have been very successful actions on Facebook and Twitter in closing down accounts recently. But having said that, what's going to happen in the next 6 months, I think, is anybody's guess. But I mean, certainly, it's like you say, it's not something we haven't seen before. And I think the dangers to debate coming up are wider than social media as well when it comes to bots. I mean, there's many other types of botnets that can be deployed to censor journalists, whether it's DDoS attacks, flooding websites to take them down, or I think my personal prediction will be social media hacking. You know, and we're seeing a lot of very good AI routines put into customizing phishing attacks based on people's social profiles and things like that. So I think there's a real danger that media houses have to think not just about how do we fight the bots and what they say, but how do we actually think a little bit more seriously about our own digital security as well, because we're going to be under attack.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of have this idea of faceless networks. I mean, I can imagine even for various reasons the Iranian government, you know, the Russian government being involved. You're never going to track that down, are you? It's like impossible to do. More questions? Ferial Hafaji.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. So I've noticed that all the major political parties are deploying trolling armies, which are a little bit different to botnets. And I'm wondering if you studied that and what we can do about it. And I've asked the top 5 parties to give me their just their proportion allocations to social media advertising, not even content, and all of them have refused. Is there anything that we can do if they're supposed to place it in a repository? Because how are we going to know what they're putting out if they don't tell us? It's ubiquitous.
Oh, fair okay. The pieces of legislation that South Africa has at the moment. So let's just take the representative, the RPBF. I'm sorry to use the acronym, which allocates money to representative political parties, and that money they can use for mounting their political campaigns. But the law is silent on how they use the money. So you can get the report, you can look at their annual returns. It will not tell you, it will not give you the level of detail that we're asking for. So I do think that even within the current architecture of laws, there are certain things that we can do that will give us access to, for example, how, if they're using taxpayers' money to run political campaigns, can you get more detail about what is it paying for? Is it paying for social media? Is it paying for T-shirts, etc., etc., etc.? I think that is an avenue. I don't know how useful it would be, but certainly I think that kind of information is there. Now, political parties do not like the Electoral Commission to put it under scrutiny. They always remind us that. But the job of the Electoral Commission is to rise above that and say, I know you don't like me asking, but I will ask in any case. That's what I'm hired to do. So we do ask those questions, but our current construction does not give a lot of room to hold political parties accountable and to get the level of detail in the way that they use money for that would like. And you've seen it in the conversations around the party funding bill, for example.
Isaac, you've got your hand up. There was someone else as well.
I just want to follow up on this particular point. I just want to point out that in the guidelines that I referred to earlier, it says that government, the legal framework for the election shall provide for the proactive disclosure by political parties of campaign expenditure broken down into distinct line items and specifying the sources of funding and actual amounts. So it means that the South African government will need to force parties to do exactly what Ferial was saying.
Good luck getting them. Feel free to publish those accounts. We had one in the front, yes, sir.
Thanks, Chamber is my name. I come from Soweto. I'm asking this question for my daughter who's voting next year for the first time. She said I must ask this question because I'm coming here. When will the IEC consider electronic voting?
Okay, that's a very easy one. We are already considering electronic voting. The issue is not when are we going to consider electronic voting. The question is that at what point are we going to be able to deploy it? There is no political will at the moment to go electronic voting. Electronic voting means that the ballot paper itself is electronic. And we are, my reading of the political scene right now, we're a long way to go from that. Political parties agree, if there's anything that they agree on, is that they don't want us to move from a paper ballot. They want us to retain that. So I'm using this platform to say there's another area you can agitate, but until you have agreement in some level of political will to introduce electronic voting, then its deployment is going to take much longer.
I suppose a paper ballot does mean a paper trail. You actually see the ballot paper, and people want to see that, never mind the historic sort of feeling about it.
Yes, Brazil has gone electronic. The 19-something, the law was enacted in 1932, and then they started electronic voting. But in these elections, the political parties said that they wanted the paper trail. So they went, it's electronic voting, but with a receipt, so that you can have a paper trail. And I think if at least we can go to that. By the way, for our staff, if you think about it, the responsibility to look after ballot papers and to make sure that you deploy security to follow up that, and all the drama that comes with people saying that they found ballot papers outside voting stations. They don't care that you've counted them or not. The very fact that someone has taken a picture and put it on WhatsApp or on Twitter throws aspersions to the process. But I think we have to move there because it just makes better sense. And another thing, you don't have to wait 3 days to have to have a result. You can have results probably the same day. I know a lot of political parties who don't want elections pronounced on the first day.
There was a question at the back. Yes, sir.
Hi, good evening. I guess my question comes in two parts, a little bit, maybe, yes. So, it's two parts, yeah. How ready are we for this? I mean, you look at the Cambridge Analytica role in the European American elections, you look at the war room the ANC set up before the 2014 elections. You look at even this D8 development where you had senior members of the party sharing fake news on social media and using it to push their own agendas. How ready are we as the IEC, I mean, from a technological perspective, to deal with the onslaught that seems to be happening all across the world? And the second part is, are we then looking at a future where the IEC can hire an army of IT techs to sit there and stare at screens trying to filter all the content? And I mean, where exactly are we going?
Could I add to your question?
Yeah.
And possibly pose, someone might have a view, someone might have a view on the panel. Could it be that over time people, so when something's bright and shiny and new, we give it a lot of weight. So when Twitter came, and I'll only speak from Twitter because I'm not on Facebook at all, but you would see something on Twitter and you would give it the same weight as a book, as something published in a book. I don't anymore. So my sort of further extension of your question, if I may, is could we start to just give less weight? Oh, it's social media, so what? Adam, you look like you.
No,
I started you now.
Oh, I see. So, I mean, personally, that's already happened. I think we're already there. I think that's the really sad thing is that just before I left the UK in 2012, we had the London riots. And one of the amazing things that came out of the London riots was the day after. Actually, a friend of mine started a hashtag Clean Up London. And so you found the morning after the London riots, everybody was on Twitter, had followed this hashtag, and everybody then, literally London was covered with people with brooms cleaning the streets. And this was a really amazing moment. And those of us who were sort of all big fans of digital democracy and advocates for civic tech were looking at it going, yes, look, the internet's arrived, see how wonderful it is. And that doesn't happen anymore. You know, instead we look at what happens on Twitter and we look at the discussions on Twitter and the way that bots swarm around journalists, and I think it just puts people off, and there's very little civil debate happens on those platforms now, I think.
So I guess, I mean, the one thing is that when we talk about like disinformation, so not all of this is necessarily new. I mean, propaganda and so on has been part of politics since time immemorial. And not to kind of diminish the challenge that we're facing, because of course the platforms and the current environment amplifies it tremendously. But these are kind of new faces to quite old or quite worn problems. And I think a couple of things will happen. I do think that people will get more rigorous in understanding what the challenges are and how they view content that they find online. I think the technology will also catch up, and I think that we will better be able to address some of these challenges. And I think that the electoral bodies will also learn, I guess, what strategies work for disseminating public awareness campaigns and those partnerships with the platforms also.
Thank you. How ready is the Electoral Commission? As ready as it can be. We are preparing ourselves for an onslaught on our reputation. The thing is that in the election, if the entity that runs the election is discredited, that is half the battle won. Anything that comes out, it becomes academic. So the tactic that we've seen in especially South Africa is to discredit the election management body itself. We have also seen the people try to hack our systems. Sometimes you get towards elections, you'll get something like 600 hits within an hour as the election every single day. So yes, that's and people trying to break the system. So when there was the WannaCry thing, we had just a glitch, but it didn't hit us. So that is where we are. Election management bodies are truly vulnerable. In the Electoral Commission of South Africa, we are better equipped because we are very ICT based in any case. All our systems are based on ICT, and but it also means we spend quite a lot of money just protecting the system, refreshing our systems. And every time that we try to refresh the systems, they're saying, "Oh, you are refreshing the systems because you want to dilute the outcome of the results." So yeah, as ready as you are. But the war, I think, that we have not even started fighting is the war of the brain. It is the war of polarizing the country in such a way that it's almost impossible to have a conversation without putting it through a particular lens, whether it is a racial lens or any of those things. We see that playing out, and we're measured through that lens as well. So you don't have such facilities in such an area because it is a particular party stronghold. It is no longer you don't have a facility in this part of the country because there are just no schools that you can use as voting stations. It is because this is the stronghold of that's how we are. We no longer have well, we do have an amicable relationship with political parties, but it has turned quite a bit, and you can feel the change.
I suppose, in a way, just to pick up your thought, I mean, what I sort of noticed, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that on social media, no one ever gets the benefit of the doubt. Everyone is evil, full stop. And I mean, I think that for me is sort of the worst part of it. Other questions, other comments, and other points? Even Isaac is quiet. Yes.
So I think it's been great. So Kate Skinner. So what I found really interesting is we've talked a lot about social media and the kind of polarizing kind of role that social media plays. But what about the media itself? Because obviously, you know, there are a lot of people that are going to be going to the media, and I want to get a sense from you around the role of the media in terms of creating those spaces that are not polarized spaces. I mean, what can we do about that?
Listen to Talk Radio.
So So I suppose the biggest thing, and I think this kind of, the biggest thing with media do is the role of counter-narratives. And I think that's been a huge fundamental part that perhaps the media has always played, but now more than ever, where credible information is difficult to come by. That's the gap that I think maybe the more traditional credible forms of media who are responsible to an ombudsman, who subscribe to a certain form of ethics. That's the gap that I think the media is going to fill.
Only the only thing I'd add is as Sarah mentioned earlier, that it's not a problem any one media house can tackle by themselves. I think there really has to be a lot of collaboration around this issue, particularly when it comes to fact-checking some of the things that will come up on social media heading into the elections. There's just going to be too much for any one house to deal with it all by themselves. They're going to have to work together.
I'm going to say the obvious. The role that media play is to improve the quality of journalism. For example, affording people the right of response, for example, helps. We have had many articles published or news items published which don't help in terms of getting the message across because they are not factually correct. They're not outrightly wrong, but they don't have, they address a situation. They address the ruling of the Constitutional Court is one such example. The story gets lost in the nuances. What helps is if you get the Electoral Commission to write the stance or people to read the judgment, for example, before they pronounce on a matter, so that helps. But you do need the media to do the counter narratives and to shine a spotlight on things that don't seem to be okay, and ask questions and help people navigate the noise that is out there. It's almost impossible to run an election without a vibrant media, and that is why in other places that you limit the space of media because you just don't want to have the conversation. That then does not give you what it is that you want. I also don't think shutting down the social the social media platforms is also helpful. I don't think so. I think as weirdly as they are, I still think that shutting down social media is not the way to go. So what is the way to go? We are going to find it eventually. Are we going to find it before the 2019 elections? Probably not. Are we going to find it before the 2021 elections? Probably not. But we are used to being in this space as the human race. We will find it eventually. But it's going to be quite messy before we find a way out.
Am I allowed to have an opinion? I mean, I think you all know I have one. I think what's I mean, I noticed that, if you don't mind me picking up on this, but I mean, people often struggle with a name to call the media before social media, right? So we fall back on words like mainstream, traditional, which are then used against us in the media. And the phrase I'm sort of moving more towards, but I haven't quite finished yet in my head, is interrogated. So in other words, it's media that has both sides of the story. Interrogated. It's not because it's out and looks. I think it's maybe one phrase, William, I'm looking at you, that you could take forward. You know, the idea of, instead of calling it mainstream or traditional, we call it interrogated. And I wonder, and if the executive director of SANEF's in the room, maybe she has a view, if it's worth suggesting to media organizations that actually people like the SABC and others ignore social media. In other words, something is only reported on, so we stop trying to be Twitter. Something is only reported on. You go back to old-fashioned, if it's on affidavit, or if it's someone actually saying it to you into your microphone. And until they do that, you don't report on it, no matter how that can be. Now, I know what will happen is that callers will do it for you on Talk Radio. That's fine, you can probably manage that as well. But I wonder if that is something mainstream media should just, interrogated media should look at doing. But I mean, that might also, some people might say that's also censorship, I don't know. There we are. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Hopewell Kharem. I just want to find out from the IEC, there were times where you would find one presiding officer is able to talk to the media and tell what's happening, and they're open about it. And it makes reporting great because you are at the station yourself, you are just getting the side of the story. But you go to another presiding officer, he tells you where to go and jump, and even calls the police on you to yank you out of the because you are evil. How do you balance that? I've just not been able to get the IEC to do it in training maybe of the presiding officer. This is where the journalist can go and this far and no further. But you just find that you are at the mercy of the presiding officer.
Generally, a presiding officer and a deputy presiding officer are trained to look at the qualities of the process. They are not trained to deal with the media. However, also you want the presiding officer and the deputy presiding officer to keep their eye on the ball. In other words, to watch the process and make sure that it goes. And if access means that you're going to take them out of the station, or you are going to do any of the party agents are going to report that the presiding officer wasn't there, and it is and the battle that we the balance that we're trying to achieve as the Electoral Commission is that as a presiding officer, we need your eyes on the ball every single time. Don't let the ballot box out of your sight. Make sure that you watch the entire voting station process. So that we normally don't encourage an officer to take interviews because of that. However, they've trained on one module for registration, and I'm going to come back and say to them, "Oh, how about this lovely idea?" And they're going to say to me, "How about you would have told us long ago?" but I'm going to put it to them. I think the value of such engagements is that when you work in the election management body, you can become quite an echo chamber, and audiences like this, they help you think about things slightly differently. So I will go back and find out if there is something that you can do. Maybe release the deputy presiding officer. Maybe you can use the area managers, for example. We've got area managers who are almost like roving presiding officers that I think you can maybe train for that purpose. Something that we have not looked at, but I think it's a great idea.
Any more questions?
There's a question.
There was one at the back. What if we missed? No. All right. Tim. Sorry, it was about?
The question that was asked was about access to social media, I think, in rural areas, etc., etc. Interestingly enough, we find that our interlocutors come from everywhere in the country. The barriers to data, to access. So because we have such a huge number of cell phones available, all the data tells you that this high penetration of cell phones, the only barrier is data. So that's really the barrier. If they have the data, they will talk to you. They will engage. So what we have to do is to handle that space of data as a barrier.
Perhaps a proposal to the IEC, because I know political parties will come and to the Jamboree and sign the pledge, you know, we're going to do this and that and that and that. Now, wouldn't you think that, don't you think that maybe it should also be put and also to include the aspect of social media, because that's where political parties use it so frequently. Like, I remember when I was stationed at the IEC some couple years ago, after EFF was born, there were allegations that there were ballot papers that were found in Alexander, thrown there, they marched to Maseko and stuff like that. So I'm just thinking that when they signed that pledge, wouldn't also be an idea that they must also infuse the issue of using social media responsibly. That's just a thought.
Isaac, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, just to add to that, Dr. Masuku, I think the IEC made some proposals to update the Code of Conduct for Political Parties, specifically regarding social media issues. I wonder if you can tell us more about what exactly are those updates and what is the process to get there. And that will then obviously result in the pledge to agree, for parties to agree to these new guidelines.
Quite frankly, political parties will sign anything you ask them to sign. It does not it doesn't give you any guarantee at all that they will behave appropriately when the rubber hits the top. Okay, so just it's great to build it to change the code of conduct. The problem is not the code of conduct. The problem is the integrity that people have to say that I've committed to X and therefore I will behave accordingly. But also I think that just let me talk about South Africa for a moment and not any other place. We've actually let political parties scot-free. With the Electoral Commission, for example, does not interfere in anything if it is regarded as an intra-party matter. The political parties are going to tell you it's an intra-party matter. Don't talk about it. So we've changed the law quite a bit. For example, when there are disputes around the leadership of a party, to say that can go to the electoral court for arbitration. But generally, political parties are just not put under the scrutiny that I believe they should be and can be in terms of the way that they behave, the way that they incite, the way that they make promises they have absolutely no intention or no capacity to deliver on. And people just kind of like go on like nothing has happened. And I think that is a space where I think we can do better as a country. It is to have a higher standard, as high a standard for political parties as we do for the election management body. The election management body is indeed there to provide a service to make sure that an election is run. But the way that political parties behave sometimes, I think we've got a lot of scope there of things that we can change, but are just not having the conversation.
Is it comforting to know that the Deputy CEO of the Electoral Commission is more cynical than we are? I think that's a good thing.
More practical.
We have a question.
Just a quick one from social media. Is there anything that's being done, we've spoken about the big tech platforms, is there anything that's being done about the spread of disinformation or misinformation on WhatsApp?
Sure. Is it even possible to do it?
Quick answer for South Africa, no, not yet. But not yet. Once we've procured everything, we've got a bit more time to run around talking to people. And I think there's something that can be done. In Brazil, they shut down 100,000 accounts on WhatsApp. So it's doable. But the question becomes if the Electoral Commission believes that it is within their reach to do so, or it is something that you should give to another structure, like, at the moment I don't know who. That's the conversation that we are asking ourselves. We're saying, who do you give it to? I think the Advertising Standards Authority would have been a great one, but it's a voluntary relationship when it's not under liquidation. And they're saying to us, we'll have another when will you have it? I don't know. And they've changed something. So I've got, we don't have a problem generally about having all these provisions, signing things, and then we go on our merry way and do exactly what it is that we want. That's why we're questioning the Constitution as we sit here.
Any more before we close off? Final question.
Yeah, indeed. You will. I don't know whether it's possible, but there are hotspots in the past, you would then say these are the hotspots, we're going to be looking at them, but it was mostly related to service delivery and so on. Those very hotspots will be the volatile one in terms of social media as well. Any lie can easily be spread and say, we saw this, we saw that. Would you be having, is there a likelihood that you would be having maybe a team to look at what kind of social media, Twitter is being spread about certain hotspots? Obviously, there could be one that you're not identifying as a hotspot that can mushroom, but mostly those that you know, that you would then say, we have to watch this one so that